Hello and welcome to the Bellevue Literary Review Spring Celebration. I'm Danielle Ofri, Editor-in-Chief of BLR. Today, we will be celebrating the winners of the 2021 BLR Literary Prizes. The authors will be interviewed by 3 BLR editors, and then you'll have a chance to hear some of these incredible works of fiction, poetry, and nonfiction, freshly picked for spring. If you don't know Bellevue Literary Review, BLR is a literary journal that publishes creative writing about health, healing, and illness. If you want to get your own copy, hard copy or digital, please visit us at blreview.org. You can sample writings, see videos, hear interviews. We hope you want to buy a copy or give one as a gift. BLR exists to help bring new writers to the public and help us all grapple with these existential issues in ways that are creative, moving, and often fun. We're excited to be celebrating our 20th anniversary this year. 20 years is a lifetime for most literary magazines, and we are immensely grateful to our supporters and subscribers. If you aren't one yet, we invite you to join our growing community. You won't regret it. First up today is Galen Schram, winner of the Goldenberg Prize for Fiction. His story, Tattoos, was selected by Dan Schoen as the winner. I also want to mention the wonderful story that earned honorable mention, Admonition by Benjamin Kessler. Galen will be interviewed by Suzanne McConnell, one of BLR's fiction editors, and then you'll hear Galen read a short excerpt from his story.
Hi, Galen.
Hi, Suzanne.
We talked the other day about this quote from Oscar Wilde, which is, "Give a man a mask and he will tell the truth." And I had several questions that sort of came around that quote. And one is that you wrote this story quite right in the middle of this pandemic. And the story really captures the denial of it and the intensity of it beautifully and then concretely, generally and concretely. And so I wondered when I first read it, which was way back in June, how on earth you were able to capture this right in the middle of that. So I'd like to know a little bit about that. And also I asked you, what was the story behind the story? So maybe you can put all that together.
Sure. Yeah. The story Tattoos takes place like a little over a year ago when the pandemic was really starting to ravage New York City and in particular the hospital where I worked. And I remember just every day watching the reality that I knew just start to dissolve. I work in a hospital, and then watching the unit that I work on it's now no longer oncology, it's COVID. And then suddenly there's now no neurosurgery unit, it's now COVID. And just one by one watching these floors convert into COVID units. They canceled elective surgeries, just everything about the life that I knew was just falling down. And with this like new surreal kind of reality I was living, I had such anxiety that like no one's gonna know this is happening. It's just I had such a disbelief about what I was experiencing, and I somehow needed to share it with somebody so that I would know that sharing it would somehow provide me some peace of mind in a way. And so for me at the time, I decided to start writing about it. So I would come home from work after these crazy days where things were happening that I never thought could ever happen in a place where I live and work. And I would write about it. And that provided me the peace of mind I needed at the time, that at least in this space that I'm creating, I'm preserving what I'm experiencing, that I can somehow share it with others. Of course, at the time, I had no idea if anyone would ever read what I was writing, but here we are. And as for the Oscar Wilde quote, I've always reached for fiction when it's come to when I want to write about something, because creating a fictional character and then giving them similar experiences that I've had gives me an opportunity to explore these experiences and emotions with just enough of a distance that I can do so more objectively. So, for example, in Tattoos, it's not Galen Schram's story. It's I created a character named Dylan, and it's Dylan's stories. It's through his eyes that we witness everything that goes on in tattoos. And for me, I found that very helpful while I was writing it to sort of process the chaos as best I could in real time. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it really answers it. Yeah, that's precisely why I used to give that quote to my students.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I think I knew it before I even knew it. I mean, we spoke about when I first started writing, and it was long before. Now when I was in college, I remember writing about a character I made up named Taylor Pence, and I would give him similar experiences that I had in college. I did it at the time. If you had asked me, just it's my creative outlet. I studied sciences and I enjoyed writing on the side, but looking back on that experience now, I think that's exactly what I was doing.
And this is your first published story, right?
It's actually my second. It's the first that I've submitted for publication, but it just so happens that I submitted a second one through a different journal and was published through there. But it's all been a pretty new experience and recent.
And how was that experience of being edited and being accepted, and anything to do with our particular role in your process?
Well, first, it's very flattering. I mean, I've never had a professional editor offer me such close criticism and ideas for something that I'd written. So, to be honest, I think I had a little bit of imposter syndrome right at the beginning, but I worked through that. And I think when I sat down to write, I had such an idea of what I was feeling at the time. And working with you with the editing, I think you really helped me to hone what I was feeling in a way that others who are not physical therapists in a hospital can pick up and then have a better understanding of what it is I was trying to convey. It was also, it was a wonderful two-way street. It wasn't, this is what you should do and this is how you should change it and this is what you should do to make it better. It was more, I have a question about this. How can we clarify this one sentence, or what is it that Dylan's experiencing in here, and how can we clarify this emotion or this bit of dialogue? And I would answer those questions, and I think it was very collaborative, and I'm proud of the result. I'm excited for people to read it.
I'm excited too. I think it's a fabulous story.
Oh, thank you.
The kinds of things I was asking you were the kinds of things I think when you know something very well, like the setting of the hospital. I was asking you very precise about how can he see that, or how does he know that? Because you like we all do, make assumptions that
Right.
see what we see. And so, yeah, they were clarifying questions mostly. Yeah.
They were. I mean, something as simple as the color of the scrubs that I had my characters wearing, and they were also wearing these contact isolation gowns. I mean, I know those gowns are transparent, so you still know the color of the scrubs, but you're like, how can you know the color if they're wearing these, personal protective equipment? So something small like that, I wouldn't even think about.
Right. Yeah. Pity your reader. You've got to tell them what's going on. And I would like to know how now. Your story represented really what we were all going through here in New York right away. It really captures that. But now we're all going through something else, and it is almost a year. God, COVID.
Just over a year, yeah.
Yeah, it's a year, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how do you feel about the story now? Do you think it accomplished what you wanted it to do for the future? We're all going through a shift, so.
Yes, it's been so interesting. I think these last few weeks preparing for this publication, reading something that I had written around a year ago. I think one of the reasons why I wanted to write this story in the first place was, I think when I think back about when COVID first took over my hospital, I think about ventilators and I think about proning patients and the emergency room. But I think the toll that the pandemic took, particularly on people who had baseline mental health diagnoses, was tremendous. So I mean, for example, the character Dylan that I created, he was attending group therapy, but when the city shut down, there was no more group therapy, and that the impact of that on his overall well-being was quite profound. So I wanted to sort of preserve that space. I wanted people to remember how difficult the pandemic was for that particular population. And then add that also into the fact that a lot of people, myself included, and my character Dylan, their loved ones were in states other than where they were, and that fear of going to work and working with these tremendously ill patients, and seeing like your parents' faces projected upon those patients, it's almost paralyzing. So thinking about that now, as I sit here, I'm so happy to tell you that as of last week, both of my parents are fully vaccinated, and that relief is it's so tremendous. Like, I don't think I've ever felt that much relief in my life, and I couldn't have imagined feeling like this a year ago when I was writing that. I also think a lot about like the racial disparity amongst COVID infection and death rates. I remember back in April 2020, when Tattoos takes place, there was an article in the New York Times that was just beginning to state the trend about how Latinx and Black New Yorkers were being infected and dying from COVID at higher rates than white New Yorkers. And then now we turn on the news and I'm hearing stories about like vaccination rates and the similar kind of disparity there. I mean, my parents were part of the top 10 mostly white counties where people were 80% more likely to have received at least the first dose of COVID vaccines than the other counties in Florida. And that I saw that on a CBS News report. So I think whenever we look back on COVID in the future, I want those trends to also be right there and at the forefront, so we can demand better.
Yeah, and you did a marvelous job in that story of putting up front the plot of the story, the relationship between the patient and Dylan, but also through Dylan's problems and his roommate and other characters, really showing all of those things. I think it's a wonderful story. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Yes, it affected everyone differently. So I'm glad that you picked up on the different characters and the different way that they experienced the same phenomena.
And I guess you've answered my question. Did it help you to write the story? How do you feel about that at this distance? And can you talk more about that?
Yes, I think at the time, like, writing really helped me to process what I was feeling now, and in a way, like, the editing, or at the time, it helped me to process what I was feeling as it was all going on. And I think the editing and preparing has also helped me to process like a year in review, kind of like where we are now compared to a year ago. I think I mean, the writing process took place while the pandemic was unfolding, and now the editing and getting ready for publication is taking place while we're talking about vaccination rates, which is just great. So the journey of Tattoos has sort of paralleled the journey that New York City has undergone with COVID coming and rising above, which I think is nice and symbolic.
And have you written something since? Have you been writing this year since then?
I have been, yeah. So I'm a student of narrative medicine at Columbia University. I do an online program, and so I've been taking a few classes where I've been working on writing through that program. I've done some writing on my own too, but that's where most of my focus has gone.
And that's your background. That's where you started writing.
That is, yes. I suppose I started this on my own in college, but it wasn't until I took an elective in graduate school in narrative medicine, which is all about exploring the relationship between the humanities and medicine, that I began to actually study it, like the craft of writing and learning the tools that I need in order to be a more effective writer. And within the last, actually, when Tattoos takes place, I was writing it while I was in my first semester of this online program that I'm still enrolled in for narrative medicine.
Were you presenting that story? Did you get in class or get any kind of feedback from the story as you wrote it before?
What's interesting, no, so not tattoos itself, but I did write similar ideas. I would write about a physical therapist at a hospital in New York, but it wasn't Dylan and it wasn't the hospital in the story. But I fleshed out some ideas, I suppose I can say, with some instructors.
And the patient character, she's such a vivid character. She's a wonderful character. Is that based on someone that you met in the hospital, a patient of yours in the hospital?
I suppose she's maybe a combination of several different patients I've worked with. I mean, I love I kind of love a patient who's a little bit sassy, and that's what I was going for with this. I think a patient where, I mean, when I was rereading the story, looking for which excerpt to choose, there's a line where Dylan, the physical therapist, tells his patient to shut up and breathe. And I think, you can't do that with just any patient. It takes a certain dynamic between a clinician and a patient.
I noticed that line when I just reread it. I particularly noticed that line.
Like Dylan's a little bold there, but you know what? I mean, she was sassing him, and he sort of just gave it back to her a little bit, and for them, it really worked. I think that enhanced the relationship. So, I mean, I love that kind of dynamic.
Yeah. And the other detail in this story is your Dylan character has tattoos, and the patient, Maddie, says that her son has a tattoo, and it's a tattoo of a watch, and she says that she said to him, that thing doesn't tell time, don't you? And you could just hear her humor and her pizzazz with her son. And then you're detailed at the end of the story where Dylan, without telling the whole thing, sees the watch tattoo on someone next to him, and has overheard the cadence of his voice and knows that it's just I want to say your details are implying rather than, you're not bombarding. It's a very nice circular touch for that story.
Oh, well, thank you. I love tattoos, and that they can mean something different for every person. There's a story behind everyone, and I think Dylan is very particular with. There's 3 tattoos that I mentioned that he has, and each one has a story behind it, and something that the tattoo itself gives him or reminds him that he already has.
Well, I interrupt you here because I don't like tattoos. I'm 2 generations or something older than you are, and so for me, and I grew up in San Diego, and who had tattoos were the sailors, who were the down and out guy, blah blah blah. So, but your story, because Dylan is not, he gets tattoos. It's part of his therapy.
It is like his own therapy that he found for himself, really.
And he says that the price tag was less than all the therapy he had gone to, and with more bang for his buck.
Exactly. Yeah, like he overdrew his banking account getting his first tattoo, but it was by less than what his mom fleshed out for him to attend therapy. Yeah.
So I had never considered that once. I mean, I considered a lot of things about identity and so on in terms of people having tattoos, but I had never thought of it as therapeutic in that kind of way.
What I was thinking about when I was coming up with the idea of tattoos was, that ancient story that there's many different versions of it, but about King Solomon, who sought the advice of a wise counselor to help him become enlightened. And this wise counselor gave him a ring with the inscription, "This too shall pass," and along with the instructions of any time he's feeling depressed or he wants to feel that wisdom of the advisor, to touch the ring, and then he'll be reminded of that. So in a way, I find Dylan's tattoos to be his "This too shall pass" ring, although they mean different things, but it's a similar idea.
The only thing is the tattoo won't pass.
Yeah, it might need a touch up.
If it's over it, then the tattoo's still going to be there, but whatever. Yeah. I'm wondering if whatever you learned in the editing process will contribute to you as time goes on.
Absolutely. I think I'm really going to take in more in as I'm writing maybe a first draft is how will someone else who picks this up with a different experience from me interpret what I'm writing. So I think having that sort of global view, being less sort of egocentric while I'm writing is something that I learned from editing process that I will carry forward with me in whatever it is that I'll write next. Within a week, COVID-19 usurped all semblance of your hospital's normalcy. A deficit in isolation gowns and face shields resulted in dozens of clinicians calling out sick with COVID symptoms. One intensivist lay intubated in her own ICU. Each day, another department dissolved into a COVID unit. Neurology, cardiology, even pediatrics blurred into COVID, and COVID. Any patient presenting to the emergency room with non-viral symptoms was quickly turned away or redirected to the hospital ship USNS Comfort docked in New York Harbor. Physicians' offices converted into negative pressure rooms to treat patients, and operating room nurses trained to treat bedside. You overheard an attending pulmonologist tell the charge nurse that the number of COVID-positive admissions increased by 20% every day, and that the shipment of a half-dozen ventilators from the local animal hospital relieved only a minuscule amount of pressure. Within your department of rehabilitation, therapists not working with COVID patients were redeployed to assist elsewhere. The following week, while several of your friends fielded phone calls from distraught family members, ran blood products to patient rooms, or transported bodies to the morgue, you were meeting Mrs. Matilda Brown. "What now?" she groans. You note the indents of the nasal cannula on her skin between nostril and ear. "My name is Dylan. I am from the physical therapy." "Can't hear. You're wearing a goddamn spacesuit." Her furrowed brows beneath pink headscarf remind you of Frida Kahlo. You step closer and introduce yourself. You outline the importance of mobility and strengthening her lungs as they battle with the virus. Mrs. Brown offers you your favorite excuse. "I'm too weak for physical therapy," she dismisses with a wave of her bruised hand, a capped IV taped to her wrist. "That's what I want to help you with," you counter. "It's my job to help you strengthen your muscles and improve your breathing. Staying in bed all day is the worst thing you can do right now." "No thanks, sweetie. Not today." According to her chart, 70-year-old Mrs. Brown developed dry cough and shortness of breath 12 days prior. When she could no longer stand up from the couch without huffing, her son drove her to the emergency department. A doctor admitted her and prescribed supplemental oxygen. In the weeks since, all attempts to wean Mrs. Brown to room air had failed. She had not left her bed while the virus wreaked havoc on her respiratory, circulatory, and gastrointestinal systems. That was where you came in. Overnight, you had become a Band-Aid physical therapist. Get him strong enough to walk 25 feet without passing out. This was the new standard. If patients could do this, then they could return home, and one of the hundreds of overflow patients awaiting beds in the newly erected circus tent outside of the emergency department could be admitted. So you have to push back a little. You recall a line from the social worker's assessment and Mrs. Brown's chart and decide to play it up. "I hear you're quite the singer," you say. "Who do you hear that from?" she replies with a side eye. "Your son told the social worker about church choir. You'll need to strengthen those lungs of yours before you get back to it." "That evil boy," she mutters, but she is grinning. You think you've won, but still no. I'm too tired, and church is closed anyways. Maybe tomorrow, sweetie. If this were a month ago, you'd accept her offer in order to salvage the rapport. In the moment, however, you're cognizant of how the hospital has rationed the scant personal protective equipment. The thought of wasting an isolation gown on a patient's refusal is gut-wrenching. So you press upon your left forearm, and the magic of the black orchid fills you like sunshine. When my mom calls me sweetie, it's not a term of endearment. It's a poison-tipped arrow. This makes her laugh, which snaps something. Boy, you are persistent, Mrs. Brown says. Fine, you can walk me to the toilet, but only because I can't take more of the goddamn bedpan.
Next up is poetry. Saleem Hue Penny won the Marka and Jan Vilcek Prize for Poetry. His poem, Nevertheless, was selected by Jen Bervin as the winner. I also want to acknowledge the fabulous poem that earned honorable mention, Yellow Throat by Eileen Wagoner. Saleem will read his poem and then be interviewed by Sarah Sala, one of BLR's poetry editors.
Nevertheless, we still grate again. Restrictive covenants hit like bricks. We grate, migrate again. Redlined, we wait. We congregate like food pantries and funeral wakes. Breaths held like sentencing dates. Hoping for change like '08. The city is a project. Public works in progress. We budget for broken promises. The black rabble in a parking lot where lakeside daisies used to be. In UV, we see the block is soaked redder than they would believe. Wearily, we seek our daily bread, pearl crescents inflamed. Disenfranchised insects have to eat, even if it's dogbane. Like uncle's hand-me-down compression socks, life expectancy falls. Nevertheless, we, the people, find soft tissue and push through. Carpool to the pharmacy drive-through, split the bus pass to dialysis. Since the Constitution, our family history been a qualifying life event. Half the claim covered, no flex to spin, avoiding fruits and vegetables, the other molar sits, rotting in. Shameful how our pain been cared for less. Substandard deviation and educated guess, yes. After cultural competence training, they will treat us fully, 3/5. Significant tenures from our insignificance. Meanwhile, safety net clinics stay short-staffed and federally qualified. So Brother Death volunteers since dawn outside. Navigates the line patiently, clipboard and scythe. Greets the abuelas with pride in their eyes. Buenas noticias, la traductora está aquí. Por favor, entren. Es seguro. No ICE inside. We still wait again. Shamed in the intake again. Praying we not blamed for the pre-existing conditions.
Ooh, thank you so much, Saleem,
Thank
for
you.
just putting that into the air. What a beautiful poem. How does one write a poem like this? There's, if you're not seeing this on the page, there's 3 different columns. Like when I first came to it, I started reading, first column, second column, and then it occurred to me, I was like, wait, there's way more play on the page. I can read it all the way across too.
I did a couple diagonal ones too, so that's exciting to hear. So with this particular piece, with Nevertheless, I knew, I did not know the title from the start. Often that's the last thing I do when writing a piece. However, I knew that the first line, I knew it was "We Still Great" again, right? And so obviously pushing back, I wrote this piece in 2020, although it's, coming out in 2021. And so we're still under, a previous administration that had the slogan of "Make America Great." Or "Make America Great Again." I don't really remember. But the point is, I wanted to push back and how that short set of words that had been associated with a particular platform, a lifestyle, a way of exclusion, a way of discrimination, etc. Even how those words sort of punched, like like those words literally would hurt, and or kill, right? And so I wanted to see how I could sort of play with the idea of greatness, and is there a way to kind of use some of that language and interrogate, what does a great society look like, a great city, a great country, and a great people? What does that actually look like? So that was kind of the impotence for the 3 columns, and wanting to hopefully inject this with a sense of rhythm as we go through, in spite of how the topics might have been heavy at times.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that echo, there's so much to unpack, like you were saying, like to push back against, to protest, but also to reclaim one's greatness, to be like, we've always been great.
Right.
I was hearing echoes of Gwendolyn Brooks, the pool players, like, we real cool, we left school, we lurk late, we strike straight. That really, like, it's a wonderful beat, but there's a propulsion there. Like, it carries us through the poem.
Right.
And I wanted to ask you about the musicality of your work. Is that something that you think about when you conceive of the poem, or is that something that kind of just naturally seeps into it? Well,
first of all, that's a huge compliment to even be in the same conversation, let alone sentence, as the legend, Miss Brooks. And I'm also smiling because a piece I just wrote last month is I'm starting a series looking at a lot of people have probably seen that famous photo of Negro boys on Easter Sunday. And so there are 2 Works Progress Administration, so federal photographers who were hired across a 2-3 week period to document life in the Black Belt in the 40s. And so that was just one picture of, I don't know, they're on the Library of Congress. I've scrolled through and there are hundreds of them, right? And so it's kind of doing this phrases piece where I'm sort of mashing up Gwendolyn Brooks poems with these black and white photos. And so I'm just smiling because the one I had just written was a golden shovel of that golden shovel. So it was just, that was funny. Sort of taking the pool players and saying, what let's imagine their life. And so it's a piece looking at the fathers of the pool players, right? And so, again, just thinking about family. So rhythm is so important to me. Sometimes when I write, I am writing to music that I'll produce myself. And other times I'm writing with the idea of hoping that if somebody's reading it, they're kind of nodding their head, right? And kind of that idea of, after you write a piece, walking up and down the driveway and saying it out loud. And if I stumble, that's not a good example because I have a vestibular disorder, so I stumble a lot. But if you were to read it and something doesn't really work, then it's time to come back to that page. And so literally drafts, I would go through and be like, stumbled or tripped, or the meter was off, even though on the page it still looked like it fit in the column. The meter was off when walking and reading it. So the musicality and the rhythm was really important.
I love that image of you walking with the poem. It feels so embodied. Like when I read it, I couldn't help but, feel that punctuation, feel that movement in that beat. And I think a poem for me that makes me really happy is something that connects my mind to my body and makes us feel like, these poems aren't written in ivory towers. They're written for people and by people to be enjoyed.
Right.
To memorialize things, but also, to celebrate.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, it's so great to hear. And, just knowing that it's a shame every time I meet somebody who says, like, I can't read poetry or I can't understand poetry, or those sort of joke. He'd be like, I wish I was smart enough to understand poetry. And it's like, come on. I mean, granted, I don't think an artist should necessarily have to write in a particular way for a particular audience. And we always need some avant-garde because that's life. But I also think there's something to be said for kind of opening the door and opening the room for folks to enter the page and find where they fit. I had to shout out some of my colleagues back in Chicago. Contextos is this incredible nonprofit, and they use memoir writing with adults who have either been part of the criminal justice system, are currently incarcerated, or have been impacted. Their lives have been impacted by incarceration. And just that idea of claiming your story and rewriting your story, and when other people control your narrative, what that means over a lifetime, right? And so that's something that I've learned from working with those everyone is called an author. They're not called a client or a participant. They're called an author. And, working with those authors, reading with them in Cook County Jail, like really realizing that these aren't just la 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 la, like people died trying to learn to read, and just it's such an honor and a responsibility, you know, anytime we publish and put something out there for the world.
That is, I feel it in the poem. It's so beautiful, that intricacy of the responsibility, you know, with literacy, and how much of a privilege it is as well. I think that's just so remarkable. Yeah, to remind all of us that many people are not in control of their own narratives.
Right.
So speaking, however the I speaks in a poem is really remarkable. And I think when folks say that poetry isn't for them, or that they're, you know, maybe that they can't access poems, I always ask them, like, what is a poem to you? You know what I mean? What is your conception of it? So I guess, what is a poem to you, Saleem? Like, how would you define it?
Gosh, man. Okay, that's one of those questions where you're on a panel, you wish that the person had provided you ahead of time. You're like, whoa, that's what is a poem to me, was the question.
Yeah, I mean,
wow,
like, I gotta get paid extra for this, but
yeah,
I mean, even in the most basic sense, right? Because we talk about poems as songs,
as
memorial.
I'd say a poem to me is some truth. I wouldn't say all truth or the truth, but some truth, because you can read something and you can tell, like, nah, I didn't really feel this, you know. And I'm not saying I didn't feel this as in I didn't like it, but like literally I didn't feel this,
right.
You know. And kind of, I think the poems for me, that just, when I look at the poem and I finish it and I'm like, I'm not the same person anymore, because I experienced that poem. And especially when that happens page after page after page over the course of a book, I mean, that's the dream right there, to sort of be able to shape and reshape and tear apart and build back up, you know, from cover to cover with the person. So that's the dream. And that's why poetry should be able to be accessible, so everybody can experience that feeling of being, you know, built up anew. That's
wonderful. Yeah. Ooh, I'm glad I asked that question.
Yeah.
And I feel like
some truth
is successful in that way, in that as I'm reading it, I feel like the trap doors of like my heart and intellect and emotions, it's like, we keep they keep opening onto these new like vistas, you know what I mean?
Wow. Yeah.
It was really successful for me in that way.
Thanks. I appreciate that. That's part of what I was hoping to do with, I think we mentioned kind of being able to read it in multiple directions and from different ways, and sort of not wanting to delegate how the reader had to experience it. But one thing, you know, that I'm thinking about is often when you write a poem and then by the time it comes out to the public, if it's published, a lot might have changed, you know, in your process or your life. You know, during the course of this, you know, even things I talk about like diabetes, like I didn't know I was going to be diagnosed with diabetes, you know, dealing with the medical system. I had no idea my mom was going to be diagnosed with cancer and pass away 9 weeks later. And, you know, just so many of these systems that I wanted to hopefully interrogate. Stylistically, it also makes me think of how this poem was kind of like just the beginning of something that I've really been trying to push, in many ways, motivated by I would like to say she's a mentor, but if not, I would say at least a poet that I strongly admire. Dawn Lundy Martin told me in a workshop, she said, you know, I'd encourage you to break free of the tyranny of the left margin. And like that stuck with me. That was June of 2019. And just that idea of, I don't think I necessarily accomplish it here because there's still plenty of left margin, but of just this idea of like my whole life was told like, this is how you have to exist on the page. And like how liberating when you realize that you don't have to exist that way on the page, both in what you say and in how you say it and in how it's presented. And so that's a thing that I hope that I'm really pushing in the last year since, you know, working on this piece, that's coming across in my current work even more.
Absolutely. That's so wonderful to free yourself from the tyranny of the left margin. And I think this poem pushes back in the sense that it really magnifies it. It's in triplicate. It's like 3D, simultaneous. All these different moves are happening in the poem. So in that way, I felt like it injected a really nice sense of like resistance and agency, but also play. that movement again too.
That's great to hear. Can I do a quick side note? When you said play, have 6.5-year-old twins, and again, props to the in-laws for taking them out for ice cream right now, because otherwise there would be all sorts of stuff in the background. But our daughter is just started a poetry unit in school, and so it's so fascinating. I'm doing e-learning all day, so I'm always hearing different classrooms, and their first day they're like, okay, we're going to talk about our poetry voice. And I was kind of like, okay, where's this going? And she was like, when you read poems, you read them in a different voice than how you talk. And I was still kind of like, okay, where's this going? But that notwithstanding, it's just been so cool to see a 6.5-year-old be taught the concept of voice, and have her sort of realizing like, well, this is my speaking voice, this is my singing voice, this is my funny poem voice, this is my copycat poem voice, which that doesn't sound like plagiarism. It's like they had to write a poem that sounded like a nursery rhyme. But to just sort of watch her sort of come into her own of like, I can have different voices. And it's just one of those moments where I'm like, I'm so glad that quarantine is awful, but I just got to listen to her, sort of realize, 30 something years earlier than I did, that you have different voices and they all can be part of you.
That's so wonderful too, thinking about all of our different selves as they show up on the page, whether all sides of us are on the page, whether there's a single self that day.
Wow. Yeah.
Props.
Yeah. Oh, wow.
Elementary poetry class.
Yeah, but I mean, you made me think about a couple specific voices that that showed up in this poem. I have a line, and I feel like I'm getting deja vu, like I already told you this, but I don't think I did, about the other avoiding fruits and vegetables, the other molar sits rotting in, and that was real life. That was one of my barbers who had to choose right molar or left molar, and then wait for a year knowing that the other side of her mouth was rotting. And what does that mean every day when there's a system, the Medicare, it said, this is what we will cover. If I wasn't blessed to have a spouse with private health insurance, I wouldn't qualify for a cochlear implant, because single-sided deafness is not covered, because you still have a good ear, a functioning ear, And so just thinking about the different systems that hopefully got interrogated, but without losing sight of, these being real people, and, real compression socks, right? And these real carpools to dialysis. So that was really important to me.
Yeah, and I like how the system of a poem can absorb all this dailiness. You know what I mean? It's almost like it's always listening and always bringing in to the poem too. And I always think about the best poems. We were talking about being moved, and the word authenticity was coming to mind too. Like, this poem is so authentic; it doesn't feel like, oh, this is a poem about X, right?
Oh, good.
Like, this poem argues this. It's just existing and being. And I think, hats off to you for making this poem, so inviting and authentic, so that by the time we get to the end of it, we are changed, like you said.
Oh, that's great. That's an honor. Thanks. Thank
you so much. And I was going to ask you, Saleem, if there's anyone you want to shout out that, is a poetry mentor. I always think of like mentors of the mind, right?
Yeah. Well, maybe I'll shout out like a couple of mentors, and then a couple of things that I've been reading. So I say at the mentor list, for sure, just the whole Cave Canem community. Was blessed to be able to go before quarantine, and just to be in a room with Black poets. I had never experienced that, and it was like, I kept waiting. I joked that I kept feeling, on Showtime with Apollo, like the Sandman comes out and like pulls you off the stage. Like, I kept expecting the Sandman to come pull me off and be like, whoops, we made a mistake. But I was like, it's imposter syndrome, right? We got to push through that. So I'd say Raymond and Trobos has been extremely supportive, especially on this hearing journey of losing my hearing within the last 18 months, and himself being a deaf poet. I'd say another mentor, Louise Ewing, for sure. I got to throw the Dr. Eve on front of that, as our kids call her, and kind of this idea of mastery, right? And but like in the Kerry James Marshall sort of way of, if there are 10 disciplines of painting, becoming a master at each of those disciplines by focusing so intently, so that, you know, if it's I don't want to show up, but I don't know art terms, so I apologize. I'm about to start naming like something that's, but you know, anyway, different genres, and how I feel like in many ways Dr. Ewing does the same thing, right? If it's going to be a puppet show, if it's going to be a play, if it's going to be, I mean, I'm waiting for that opera to come next, if it's going to be a comic book, and kind of that idea of pushing my own art and trying new things for the excitement of it too. And I'd say, as far as the things that I'm reading right now, I'm reading Courtney Lamar Charleston's newest book, Doppelganger, and that's incredible as far as just somebody of a similar age and coming up at the same time and getting a lot of these references, but also being firmly rooted in hip hop, and both the positive and kind of problematic ways that can shape the identity as young black boys in that case. Tyree Day's book Cardinal just came right at the right time for me. He has these I'd say vintage, just because it's, you know, not with a cell phone camera, but photos, family photos that are interspersed between the poems. And just thinking of that idea, as I've been looking through so many family photos, you know, as we're that my mom kept, and just really thinking of how powerful it is to bring your people with you, and to, you know, to have them there on a page next to these words, and it's just something so simple, but to give voice to people who got you where you are. And then I'd say the only other collection that has just floored me recently is Ansel Elkin's book Blue Yodel. I think it's a couple years back, but I think you sometimes find books when you need them, not necessarily when they're published, right? And so that was one of those books where I'm 3 poems in, I'm like, I can't read this anymore. This is incredible. This is like, not just that it's great poetry, but it's like literally things I had dreamt that I saw on the page. Like I literally was like, I had a dream where I was like part deer, and then da 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 da, and I'm looking at it and I'm like, I think that's the dream I just had. Like, how did she do that? And really pointing to kind of how poetry can open up doors and windows inside of yourself, and sort of making me look at my process and kind of my artistic development in a different way. So those are the folks I'd say, both on the mentor side and the what's on the bookshelf, you know, side.
Thank you so much for taking us through that like creative trajectory. It's been so amazing, Saleem. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for this like beautiful spring look.
Oh, thank you.
It's given me hope for the summer too.
Right. Thanks.
Last, but by no means least, is nonfiction. Amy V Blakemore is the winner of the Felice Buckfar Prize for Nonfiction. Her essay, The Tapeworm, was selected by Sandeep Chahar as the winner. And the amazing essay that won honorable mention is Viable by Justine Ferron. I'll be interviewing Amy, and then you'll hear her read a selection from her essay afterward. Hi, Amy, and welcome. I'm so glad you could be here.
Thank you. I'm so excited.
So tell us a bit about your piece, kind of how it came to be, where it started, and what your process was.
Yeah, this is a special piece to me because I think I've been writing it in one form or another since 2013. It started as a poem. You know, it's one of those experiences that's so strange and that's so surreal that I had to enter it that way first. And it's only been in the last 3 or 4 years that I've started to translate it into creative nonfiction. So I was really excited it found a home with Bellevue.
So I'm curious, so when you started as a poem, what made it be a poem at that moment?
Yeah, it was that experience of being tested for the tapeworm itself. It was just a maybe 10-line poem, kind of imagining what it would be like to have that extracted from me, if that was even possible. Because the whole experience felt so surreal. It felt like a poem was a good entryway into that moment and into that feeling. And I think I needed more emotional distance from it to actually write it into a real narrative, into real nonfiction.
You know, we just heard from Saleem. He talked about his definition of a poem is a truth, finding the truth. So I find it fascinating that you sort of saw that as the first sort of manifestation of this truth of your story. And I'm wondering, you know, what is the process of converting a poem to a nonfiction essay?
Oh, many years, many years, a lot of distance. I actually exchanged an earlier draft with my father, who was there with me on that day of that appointment. And it was almost just as an affirmation to even myself that it was real and that was something that we actually experienced together. But it was a very elliptical piece. It took me a long time to realize that it was much more about my relationship with doctors and with the medical industry in general, and not just about that one moment. And kind of reflecting on these different micro experiences I've had in doctors' offices and gynecology offices ever since then.
It's so interesting because I'm a primary care doctor, so I spend lots of times in those offices and often write about it as well. And it's always interesting to find the other side of it. And I've often wanted to do a sort of a pairing. If you could have one of your doctors write about the experience, what do you think they would write about? Where, their observation on the other side of the test?
Oh, I would love to know. That would be completely fascinating to me. I've had good experiences with doctors too, but I think that so quickly the doctors I've had hear that I've had an eating disorder, and there's an assumption of she's neurotic, she's prone to control. And I wish there was more focus on the lived experience of it, as opposed to thinking through that etiology and thinking through almost like what was wrong with me. I feel like it almost jumps to that before it's just backtracking and letting me tell my story. And I do wonder what that primary care physician I had, would have said on that day. And I often reflect and think that she would, defer to my parents wanting that test done, and kind of the denial that went into that. I wonder if she would remember it all, and if, she would have done the same thing today.
Right. Well, as Anatoly Broyard once wrote, in his experience with going to doctors for his prostate cancer, that for his doctor, he's just one patient on the rounds, but for him, it's the crisis of his life. And you're right, maybe that doctor doesn't even remember the one of the 50 patients she saw that day. And it also points to the importance about narrative medicine. Galen, the fiction winners, is involved in the narrative medicine program at Columbia. And many of us hope that these sorts of programs do give doctors and nurses and physical therapists a chance to think about, beyond just the facts of the case. I'm curious what your father thought of the story. I think writing about family is always a dicey proposition, and you take risks, and not everything is flattering. How was that experience?
He told me it made him extremely emotional. And it was really scary to share it with him, actually, just to take this intimate moment. And a lot of the piece is how we didn't talk about, my experience of an eating disorder. And I think so many families don't talk about mental illness while they're in it, and sometimes even, while they're out of it. But I think having that distance and knowing that I've been recovered for some time, it was almost cathartic, for the both of us, just to let that memory breathe and then kind of let it go. And, giving it to Bellevue is for me almost a way of letting it go, which feels really great.
Did you ever think about writing fiction about the experience?
Yes. I've tried to write fiction about my eating disorder multiple times. It's been challenging, but I'm currently working on a novel that focuses on a protagonist who has kind of a developing eating disorder. And it's been nice because she's become more and more her own person, and she's no longer in my control anymore, which I think is always the sign of a healthy novel with its own ecosystem, its own characters. But I think I had to write this as nonfiction. I think writing it as a poem first, as fictional first, it felt like a way for me to try and enter the memory in a way that was safer and maybe more poetic. But I knew I had to get just into the heart of it and rip myself open a little bit. And it feels good to have it out there.
In the fictional character with eating disorder, do you find you're exploring other aspects that you weren't able to do with nonfiction?
Yeah, I'm focusing a lot in that story about the queer experience with an eating disorder. And it's not something I touched on my piece, but I think about a lot now my status as a bisexual person and how that intersected with my eating disorder and my perception of the female body. And it's obviously not something I reflected on when I was 16 or 17. I wasn't even out to myself. But it's nice to be able to explore that in a fictional space, kind of knowing things about the character that I wish I knew then.
Right. It's interesting to talk about coming out. I think in some ways, publishing a piece of writing is a coming out. You're bringing things that are very interior. And we talk a lot about And there are many things we write that never get published. But then the decision to publish is a coming out. That how was that experience for you?
It's terrifying at first. I shared this piece with several friends before sending it out into the world, just to make sure that it made sense, that it was coherent, and its iterations have changed so much over the years. You know, first it was really about my dad, and now it's transformed into something, you know, more about the medical industry. But I think I knew that I was ready because it's a story I've talked to with the closest people in my life. It's something I've told them about. And when people ask me to help them understand what it's like to have an eating disorder, this is the moment I return to, because it was so surreal in a terrifying way. And I think that so often there's writing about eating disorders and it doesn't focus on the fact that it's really scary and there's a sense of real horror to it. So this is the moment I share with the closest people in my life. And it felt like the moment I had to share on the page and get out there.
You know, one of the things that nonfiction writers are often frustrated by is you can't be as, you know, quote, creative as you can in fiction and poetry. But one of the things I try to argue is that you actually can be. I think you've demonstrated that because you can shift the frame, the narrative, the flash forward, the flashback, all while being faithful to the truth. But there are many ways to be creative. And certainly we read many stories about eating disorders, particularly nonfiction at BLR. And yours really stood out because of the way that it was more creative with that, or it really dealt with it in a way that explored some of the emotions without being hallmarky. You know, that's an easy place for these things to go. And this managed to stay on just that side. And I'm wondering if you could mention some of your influences, either writers, poets, you know, who you look to when you're trying to write.
Yeah, one of my favorite influences for eating disorders is actually graphic memoir and graphic novels. So there's an amazing book, Lighter Than My Shadow, How I Made It to 18. I love seeing eating disorders rendered visually because I think it's an experience that really is visual, not only for the person experiencing the eating disorder, but in the way other people interact with them and comment on their body, and it becomes a subject of debate. So I think anyone writing about the body should visit graphic memoir and graphic literature. But there's so many writers I admire whose bodies are central to their work. Like Lydia Yuknovich is my idol for all intents and purposes. And Kiese Lehman, his recent book was just absolutely incredible. And I'm very excited how many people are writing about their bodies and making it its own character, because that's how my body felt when I was experiencing my eating disorder.
I wonder if you'd comment on the parallel of having your writing critiqued with having one's body critiqued, you know, either by the medical profession or society.
Yeah, I actually think writing is so therapeutic to kind of distinguish types of critique, because when your body is being critiqued and kind of examined, it feels like there's nothing you can do to change it. Or like I did, I changed it too violently and there were repercussions there. But a piece of writing, it feels like something that you can start anew. There's no rules, there's no boundaries. You know, there's obviously moments of pain when you get that feedback to a piece, but it doesn't feel like it's its own living organism until it's done, until you've built the skeletal structure around it. So I think having that flexibility on the page is actually a really great way for rigid thinkers who might have that issue with eating disorders to flex their brains and to get away from that mental trap that can happen.
Right. Well, was it hard to get critiques on when you wrote about this very tender moment, when you got critiques from the various editors here or other people? Was that hard to assimilate?
It was difficult at first, but I think that I've been sitting on this piece for so long that I knew I had to look at it with different eyes. And, you know, just having other people comment on it and provide some revision, I think it helped make it sharper. And certainly, like you said, I think writing about eating disorders can be very melodramatic. I think it tends that way just with the subject matter. So I think having that third person just check and read it with fresh eyes is always so helpful. So I enjoyed the process.
What are you working on now? Beyond the novel, anything else?
Yeah, the novel is the main focus. There's, of course, a secondary novel that I'm trying to quiet and tell, like, hold on, we're a little busy right now. But yeah, current novel, hoping that it'll be a speculative coming-of-age story. I'm very inspired by speculative writers like Carmen Maria Machado and everything she's doing right now. I hope it's weird, I hope it's queer, and I hope it's fun. So that's the goal.
Well, that sounds like a wonderful goal. Thank you so much, Amy Blakemore. We appreciate your time.
Thank you, Danielle. My anorexia went by different names: perfectionist, prude, anxious, introverted, bitch, skinny bitch, wants boys to like her, wants boys not to like her, overly sensitive, infected, sick, riddled with a parasite. But we were only able to draw blood for the last one, so we did. My father drove me to the appointment where we would determine what to do with the tapeworm in my stomach, the one that, in all likelihood, was not real. I'd be lying if I told you I remember what we talked about on the way there. I don't. I didn't talk much during high school, unless talking was staying up late on Instant Messenger, flirting with boys with acne who said, "Sup." In the car, I pressed my face to the window, let the sun warm my skin. I was always trying in those little ways to feel pretty. It was spring, and I wanted to sprawl on the grass beside our house. Besides, I didn't think I was sick or anorexic or not eating enough. I thought I was dieting like everyone else. And after a while, eating less felt comfortable, normal, safe. The less I ate, the less I wanted, until my body became less. There was nothing bold or bright or celebrity about my eating disorder. I hardly noticed it myself until my thinness migrated from admirable to somewhat concerning to red alert waist of a girl. These shifts occurred quickly, seemingly overnight. And I could explain none of it. I couldn't explain any of my desires or behaviors in a way that made sense. I was starving myself and I didn't know why. It took a while for my family to admit that anything was wrong. There were fights at the top of the stairwell. Are you doing this for attention? There were family dinners where everyone stared at me picking from my plate but said nothing. There were words like withdrawn, thin, sick, and then tapeworm. We repeated that one. Tapeworm. Practically unheard of in our native New England or in the country at all, the CDC reports that fewer than 1,000 people are infected in the United States a year. But the idea that something had taken a hold of me from the inside was too compelling and too convenient. If proven correct, it would mean that none of this was my fault. It would mean that we could extract the intruder and leave the daughter intact. The horror of the experience would be followed by divine redemption, cleanness. But mental illness can't be scraped out.
Thank you so much for joining us today for BLR Spring Celebration. Thank you to the winners of the BLR Literary Prizes, Galen Schram, Saleem Hue Penny, and Amy V Blakemore. And thank you to my co-editors, Suzanne McConnell and Sala, for joining us in the interview. A very special thank you to the Goldenberg, Vilcek, and Buckvar families for supporting the BLR Literary Prizes. And thank you to everyone listening for being part of the BLR community. If you liked what you heard today, please pick up a copy of BLR at www.blreview.org. And you can find us on social media at BLReview. I'm Danielle Ofri. See you at the next event.